Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today is July 14th, and the topic of today's presentation is Putin's new way of conduct the war against Ukraine. So the mass media in the West is full of articles about the brutal Russian assault on Ukraine. President Zelensky called it a terrorist campaign. Trump called it a massive bombardment of Ukraine with dozens of killed. So before we go any further, I'd like to make a little correction. If we comb through attentively the reports on the bombing campaign, I hear very strange things. NBC said that in the 600 drones and missiles in one night, there were 2 killed in Kharkov, 2 killed in another region, and the total casualties were 6. Now, the day before, there was another campaign of 700 drones and missiles, and there were no casualties at all. There were 20 injured. So there's something not quite right about the statistics. Either the Russians are totally incompetent, and if they want to terrorize Ukrainian population, they just basically fail and hit in the fields or nowhere because nobody suffered. Or the targets of their campaign are not civilian targets and are military targets, and in that case, they're doing the precision strikes that haven't been done before. Another question I would have to those who scream about Russian terrorist campaign is, why are they not screaming about this with the same ardor about hundreds of killed by Bibi Netanyahu in Palestine, in Gaza? But be it as it may, let me focus on that. What is exactly new? What is happening in the Russian campaign, in the bombardment campaign, and what it actually amounts to? What is the message? This is what I'd like to discuss at some length. So, new elements in the Russian campaign. Obviously, the first and the most important one is the intensification on bombardments. Now, this is actually a very important point because it shows something that the Russians hadn't been doing. This is something new. What is it that they're doing, and why now? And the answer seems to be that the very nature of war has been changing slowly, and now we see the apogee of that change. In the very beginning of this Russian-Ukrainian war, as we call 2022, the Russians started that war in pretty much the same expectations and the same technology and the same planning as was in the Afghan war of the 1980s. And that meant the concentration of columns of tanks and trucks, and then concentration of troops. And then they very quickly went all the way to Kiev and to Kharkov, and then they had to retreat. But the point is, the conduct of the war was in a concentration of troops, relying on artillery and on air superiority and on the tanks. And that was the way the war was done at that time. The Russians got burnt really bad in that first year. First of all, the Ukrainians received massive shipments of arms that the Russians did not expect, and then the Ukrainians into the counteroffensive, and the Russians had to withdraw. And even now, 3 years later, they're slowly coming to the areas which they had abandoned in 2022 around Kharkov, and they still have not retaken Liman and Izum and the towns around Kharkov, which they controlled at that time. So the conduct of the war had been going on very, very sluggishly over the years, because throughout 2022 the Russians were on the defensive. 2023 was the year of great Ukrainian counteroffensive, and the Russians were rebuilding their industry. They're digging in, they're building fortifications, the Surovikin line to protect the Crimea, and the Ukrainians were still talking. Remember, this is very important. They were still talking about victory. just about a year ago at this time, Zelensky was touring Europe and all the other places with talking about victory, victory, victory. So they were counting on victory, and instead they ran out of steam. They ran into Russian defense positions near Crimea, and then beginning of January 2024, the Russians went into counteroffensive that had been very, very slow. And they've been moving at this snail's pace of taking one village at a time, and it still is pretty much up to this moment now had been this kind of slow pace. Now, one reason for that, as many Russian generals had explained, was the political will, because President Putin's tactics was to try to reach an accommodation, to try to make a deal. And even a year ago, in June 2024, he made essentially an offer of peace with 4 provinces, neutrality for Ukraine, demilitarization, which means banning of neo-Nazi formations like Azov, which was at the same time, at some point, banned in the United States as well. So these were the Russian conditions. Then the result was 0, victory, victory, victory. This is what we heard from Zelensky. Now, so in response, the Russians had been mounting steadily their offensive, first from Avdiivka and then moving on to Bakhmut and other areas where they're intensifying it now. So what is changed is that the Russians in that time, during 2024, have completely revamped their military production. Now they're producing more artillery shells than the combined NATO countries altogether. They're producing more missiles than anybody could ever match. And now, step by step, they're developing a new, what I would say, military doctrine. And that is no longer relying on tanks, no longer relying on concentration of forces. Exactly the opposite. If in World War I, the new weapon that was king was machine gun, if in World War II, the king was the tank and the tank armies and the breakthroughs, that served so well General Guderian both in France and in Russia in 1941. Now the king is the drone, and the combined assault of the drones and missiles. King number 1 is a hypersonic missile that cannot be stopped. And this is what I'd like to point out. This is the trump card of Putin against Trump. That is to say that Russian hypersonic missiles fly at a speed of 20 Mach or Mach, depending on the spelling. Now, the Patriot missiles can do 6 or 7. The point is the Patriot missiles are incapable of stopping Russian hypersonic missiles. Moreover, the Russian tactics is to saturate the skies with drones and fake drones, deflection drones, and that way to completely destroy their defense systems and then attacking strategic targets which they have officially published on the Ministry of Defense lists. So the targets are not civilian. The civilian casualties are usually from the debris of anti-aircraft missiles that the Ukrainians shoot, and then they fall down on the apartment buildings, which the Western correspondents so love of filming. But there are very, very scarce data on the military targets that had been hit. Now, these targets are the drone factories. The most favorite target is the units of Western advisors or forces or mercenaries. By the way, I just read a report from a Russian sympathizer in Odessa who reported that there's a lot of Latin Americans, as he put it, in Odessa, and they're in bars and they're drinking and very loud, and they all speak Spanish and they look like Latin Americans. So this means that the Western forces are present in Ukraine, and they are doing the fighting and they're presumably well paid. Now, the drones, as I said, 600 one day, 700 another day, and over the last week, as the American news media reports, over 3,000 drones. What it actually means is that the Russians have a complete superiority over the skies, and even if President Trump, as he intends to, will supply 2 Patriot missiles, 3, 10, it doesn't make any difference. They will not be able to stop the Russian overwhelming superiority over the skies. Now, there's also one other thing that the Russians have not done yet. And if President Trump chooses to escalate and to do the crushing sanctions or to some other military escalation, the Russians have one more weapon they haven't used yet. And that is the destroying of the American spy satellites. If Americans continue to provide intelligence to Ukrainians, as they have been doing up to now, this would mean two things. It would mean that it would be a Trump war, that he would inherit and take over. The fighting capability of Ukrainians depends on these satellites. Now, the Russians now have weapons, which is called Peresvet, which is sort of another light if you translate it, which can destroy satellites and their navigation system, and any electronics they have is just gone by a magnetic field, which I'm not a technician, so I don't know how to explain it to you, but I know that that is what is their new weapon. In other words, from the purely military point of view, the Russians have not shown yet all the capabilities they have, and they've been treading very, very careful in their negotiation with President Trump. Now, let me just address a little bit about the political developments in the last week. What's so interesting is that the Western media seems to be ignoring what the Russian proposals are. The narrative that I hear from Euronews and others in this is that Putin has to be forced to come to the negotiating table. Just a second. He is at the negotiating table. He published, and I see no comments about the Russian published list of demands. No NATO expansion, no foreign troops, neutrality for Ukraine, banning of neo-Nazi formations, legalization of Russian language, guarantee of Russian language minority rights, etc., etc. What is so wrong with these demands? They talk as if there are no Russian demands, as if Putin had to be forced into coming to the negotiating table. And I think the crucial word here is as if. The Europeans act as if something is there which isn't, or if something isn't there as if it were there. For example, this so-called reconstruction of the Ukraine conference. When I watched it in Rome, I just had a feeling as if it's some kind of a theater of absurd. All of it was as if it were like it wasn't. It was completely detached from reality. So we have Zelensky coming there again in his weird t-shirt or kind of a football player's gown or shirt or whatever. And then he gets standing ovation, everybody applauding. And that's what he loves. The guy loves being in the center of attention and being applauded to. I think this is what it's all about. He just loves the attention. He gets a kick out of it. And then, as if he was winning. Well, he's not. It's clear to anybody. As if European Union had money. They made all kinds of promises and investment and reconstruction and speeches about Marshall Plan, as if they won the war. But they haven't yet. What are they going to reconstruct if the Russian missiles are coming every day? You have to make a deal with Russia first. But they act as if it's over. And then Macron makes speeches how the coalition of the willing is going to put their forces inside Ukraine, and they're going to make sure Ukraine can defend itself and that they have enough war material. I mean, as if. Total nonsense. The Europeans have no money. The only money they have is stolen money from Russia. And if they actually go and use it, which they're beginning to do, Russia said that they has not announced yet what kind of countermeasures they would undertake if they confiscate 300 billion Russian assets that are in the European banks. So their own money, they have none. President Macron speaks about doubling military budget, but he's got no money because the current budget in France has a big hole, and the parliament has been in crisis over months and months because they don't know how to plug in that hole and where to take the money in order to balance the budget even for this year and for the next one. Where in the world is he going to take the money to double his budget? And even if he does double the budget and they built another 30 Rafale airplanes, so what? What difference would it make? Even if they give all of it to Ukraine, it just doesn't make any sense. The Western leaders don't realize they lost the war and they better make a deal before it's too late. But they didn't, and they don't. Now, this is the second point. Now I'd like to, yes, and finally I'd like to conclude this on this note. That the Russians have not even begun to show what they have in terms of military. I think it's just hasn't dawned yet on them. And it's too bad because Trump had a chance to get away with declaring it a Biden war and making a deal which is a pretty decent compared to what it could get to in months to come. And yet he chose not to. He wants to intensify. Well, now it's going to be Trump's war and Trump's defeat. Thank you very much, and I'll see you very shortly in another edition of politics, of issues of contemporary politics with Dr. Brovkin.